She went for a run and never came back. July 24, 1997. Amy Wroe Bechtel's car is found abandoned on a remote Wyoming road. Keys in the ignition, running gear gone. No tracks, no body, no answers. As the investigation unfolds, dark secrets, mysterious suspects, and even a death row inmate emerge. But the truth about Amy's fate stays locked in silence. Was it a random predator or someone she trusted? Let's find out if you think you can handle the ending. Before we dive deeper and find out about the mysterious disappearance of Amy, please subscribe to Calis-Crime Vault for more mystery stories that strike. The morning Amy Wroe Bechtel disappeared felt like any other summer day in the Wind River country. Wide sky, the dry scent of sage and pine, a river whispering through the canyons. It was July 24, 1997. Amy, 24, slim and fast and full of a quiet, stubborn joy, had finished teaching an aerobics class and run a few errands in Lander, Wyoming. She had spent the afternoon organizing the route for a 10-kilometer race she planned to host, and by late afternoon she drove alone toward the trail she loved, intent on practicing the course. She had run these roads before. She knew the contour of the hills and the cadence of the dirt underfoot. That evening she simply did not come home. It is easy, in the calm of a telling, to lose the texture of the first hours. Imagine, instead, how sharp time feels when it begins to fracture, when calls go unanswered, when a ring at the phone becomes a small nail tapping against the coffin of normalcy. Her husband, Steve, a rock climber who had been in Du Bois scouting routes that day, returned to their house in Lander at 4:30 p.m. and found the bed made, the dog waiting, and no Amy. He called her parents at 10 p.m., then called the Fremont County Sheriff's Office. The friends and neighbors who had known Amy since her college days became searchers. People who had run alongside her in teams and trained with her, who knew the sound of her shoes on packed trail and the way she breathed through a hard climb. By the early hours of July 25th, Amy's white Toyota Tercel, unlocked, the key still in the ignition, sat abandoned at Burnt Gulch on the loop road. There were no footprints, no torn fabric, no blood, and no answer to the question all of them were thinking. When a person disappears without a trace like that, every ordinary object becomes a clue scaffolded by hope. The car, a watch, a water bottle, all are elevated into instruments of meaning. At Burnt Gulch, search crews spread out across the wind-carved slope. Volunteers in tennis shoes and hunters in orange vests, police with radios and flashlights, helicopters that painted circles across the valley, dogs whose noses followed ragged lines of scent. News crews arrived. A community's quiet grief spilled into loud coverage. Over the next days, 1,000 phone calls would inundate investigators with tips, some earnest and small, others fanciful. The breadth of the search was staggering, and the world narrowed to one glaring fact. Amy was gone, and the land that had raised her offered no answer. There is a particular terror in the no answer of wilderness disappearances. In the hills, violence can be sudden and absolute, or else the earth itself can swallow a person with an indifferent appetite. A misstep into a stream, a fall into a ravine, exposure in a storm. For a few weeks, authorities and friends chased every such hypothesis. They searched lakes, mines, and old road cuts. They examined the possibility of a wild predator. But as the hours bled into weeks, and then into months, the theory of natural tragedy felt less like closure and more like an unbearable shrug. Amy was an experienced runner. She had the gear and the sense to deal with the wilds. She knew what it meant to be careful. The blankness of the scene, no struggle on the roadside, no sign of a fall, made people ask the question that, perhaps, no one wants to voice. Had someone taken her? Investigations in small towns grow complicated. The world is not only made of evidence, it is also made of relationships, of proximity, of jealousies, of secrets folded into the everyday. Amy and Steve had moved to Lander after graduating from the University of Wyoming. She had been a decorated distance runner there, a steady, relentless athlete with Olympic dreams pinned to the year 2000. They seemed, from the outside, to be an ordinary young couple who loved durable things, the outdoors, training, the small rituals of a life shared. But as detectives dug, they found parts of the couple's interior life, private journals, notes, and music lyrics, and crucially, Steve's reluctance to speak plainly with investigators hardened into public suspicion. Investigators later argued that certain writings found among his belongings hinted at rage and worst-case fantasies about women, and on one occasion, about Amy herself. Steve insisted the pages were art, lyrics, and creative expression. For many, that explanation was insufficient. For years, the question of whether Amy had been taken by a stranger on a remote road or by someone she knew and trusted cleaved the town and the investigation in two. The first months were chaotic. The years that followed were patient and surgical. Detectives rewound every minute of the day she'd vanished. They reconstructed phone calls and timelines. They interviewed strangers and lovers, acquaintances and old friends. They sifted through rumors as if through ash, looking for the ember of truth. The national press took notice. The story of the young athlete who simply never returned from a run made for the kind of grim, human drama that stuck to front pages and talk shows. Her family, her parents, siblings, those who had raised her in the shadow of mountain ranges, became spokespeople and anchor points for a grief that resisted being contained. As months turned into years, they launched their own campaigns to keep the case alive. Reward posters, interviews, and a persistent presence at the edge of an investigation that had slowly grown cold. One would like the police to be infallible in such moments, but law enforcement is a human arm that reaches into chaos with gloves that sometimes miss. For investigators, the journals and Steve's refusal to talk were not merely curiosities. They were obstacles. They needed to eliminate him as a suspect, to ensure that their net was cast wide. They tried techniques to get answers. In an early interview, they used a tactic known to detectives as the false evidence ploy, telling Steve they had proof he had killed Amy. He responded by stopping the conversation. That silence, to the outside world, began shaping a narrative in which intimacy and secrecy created a vacuum into which suspicion rushed. A sheriff later would say, plainly and bitterly, that in his mind there was only one person he wanted to talk to, Steve, and only one who had refused fully to cooperate. The friction between love, art, and secrecy made the case worse. It made the facts take on a color of accusation that would persist for decades. But this story is not, and never was, simply a portrait of suspicion. The investigation tested other leads, some of them dark and unnerving. Dale Wayne Eaton, a convicted murderer on Wyoming's death row, emerged as a person of interest. He had a history of violence, and accounts placed him near the area the day Amy vanished. Eaton publicly refused to speak about his possible connection, leaving yet another void. Authorities examined his background, his known travel, and the testimonies of people who could place him near roads and towns. The possibility that a predator who moved like a shadow through the region had encountered Amy on that afternoon was a hypothesis that refused to be dismissed, and it has lent the case a cold, serial undertone that chills even those who would like nothing more than a single answer, neat and final. And yet, sometimes clues arrive in shapes that look like nothing. Years later, in June of 2003, a hiker near the Popo Agie River turned in a Timex Ironman digital watch to police. The watch, a small plastic thing that might have been lost by anyone who spends time outdoors, was similar to the watch Amy had been known to own. For a moment, that small device flickered like a candle in a cathedral of absence. Tests would not conclusively tie it to her. It is the kind of lead that teaches you two brutal lessons about missing person work: that hope will appear in the found objects of strangers, and that such hope is often cruelly provisional. The watch did not solve anything, but it did make people remember, sharply and painfully, that within the quiet beat of a wristwatch there is the measure of a life. Years gather facts and myths in equal measure. Towns remember in ways newspapers can't. Conversations in grocery aisles, the way older runners will say, "I ran with her," as if proximity were a kind of testimony. Amy's case became, for a while, a national narrative of fear, a beloved athlete, imagined by many as an ordinary woman with extraordinary discipline, swallowed by the landscape that she loved. Investigators traveled leads to other states. Friends and family hired private investigators and outreach teams. Her name was read on numerous missing person lists, appealed for on television, discussed with weary familiarity on morning shows. The more public the case became, the more strained the private life of the family. Grief, like the surrounding range, has a way of reshaping the topography of a life. Every path a person walks is shaded afterward by the day when one sibling, one daughter or son, simply did not return. If the case has a cruelty beyond the immediate absence, it lies in how it asks the living to keep time. A disappearance resists the comforts of linear grief. There is no body to bury, no closed casket to visit. Amy was legally declared dead in 2004, an administrative gesture that can seem both necessary and insultingly small in the face of unresolved pain. Legal death does not equal knowing. For her family, for the people who loved her pace and her stubborn planfulness, the declaration was a kind of bureaucratic scaffolding set around an open wound. It allowed certain matters, insurance, estates, to move forward, but it did not place an answer in the one place where answers are demanded. The empty chair at dinner, the empty place in a training group, the quiet mountain trails that refused to keep their missing runner. Through the years, the case acquired that most persistent quality of human obsession, the rumor that will not die. Theories multiplied and spiraled, that Amy ran into someone she knew, that she was taken by a wandering predator, that she got lost and succumbed to the elements, that her husband knew more than he told. Each theory exacted its cost. The family had to live through suggestions that their daughter had been killed by one of their own. The community had to reckon with the possibility that some unknown male predator had existed, invisible and intersecting. Investigators, for their part, had to accept the grief of not knowing even as they were tasked with the labor of certainty. They organized new searches when new tips arrived, reopened lines of inquiry when memory and technology allowed. They also, in quieter moments, simply continued the long work of collecting fragments, small objects and witness statements, and trying to make them fit into any coherent map. There is a peculiar cruelty to the way cases like Amy's live in the public imagination. To the national audience, she was sometimes a symbol of vulnerability in the wilderness, of the threat that can exist behind an ordinary day. To the locals, she was flesh, a runner with habits and friends and a laugh that could fill a locker room. To investigators, she was a dossier of leads and contradictions. To her family, she was a daughter whose space at the table remained patronized by emptiness. This multiplicity of perceptions made the case impossible to contain. Every retelling risked making Amy into a shorthand for every fear, every hope. The task, then, for anyone who wanted to remember honestly, was to resist the flattening rush of myth and to reassemble her in the specificity of small things. Her gestures, her habits, the insignia on a sweatshirt, the rhythm of her runs, the dog they once took on a trip. Those were the pieces that kept her human in the public gaze. True crime culture today is both boom and blister. It keeps names alive and brings attention to unsolved cases. It can also create a fog in which speculation passes for evidence. In Amy's case, the revival of attention at various points, anniversaries, new leads, discovery of possible items, sent a renewed tide of volunteers and amateur sleuths to the online forums. New theories often came with the fervor of certainty. Old leads were re-examined with tools that had not existed in 1997. DNA testing had improved. Databases connecting offenders' profiles had expanded. But for all the improvement in technology, the constraints of the original scene, the lack of physical traces, the possibility that key evidence had never existed, meant that technological advance could only do so much. There was no DNA to pull from a sweater if the sweater was never found, no hair to match if the hair was not recovered. The passage of time gnawed at leads the way frost shreds the edges of a trail map. In the quiet stretches between press releases, the family did what families do. They remembered in the small ways that make up the ongoing ritual of love. They kept Amy's photographs on mantles. They told stories to new generations. They kept alive the cadence of daily life. Some of her friends set up memorial runs, the kind of events that double as a public appeal and private therapy. People who loved her pace passed her portrait and left footfalls that are both homage and petition. The case has also left a more brutal mark, a certain weariness among locals, a measured caution toward the path less traveled. People who moved through the high country found themselves thinking twice about running alone, about answering a call after dark. An entire culture of caution developed around the absence of one runner. If community responses could be counted as evidence, then the cumulative change in behavior, the extra phone calls, the shared GPS devices, the buddy systems, forms a kind of indirect aftermath of a single day. The years do not always answer. Sometimes they ask different questions instead. Detectives never stopped circling. They followed up on cold, quiet tips, visited witnesses who had since moved or died, issued renewed appeals on anniversaries, and tried to apply fresh scrutiny where once they had been constrained by limited science. They perjured Eden and other potential suspects. They probed every inconsistency in the timeline. For all the friction and for all the moments when progress seemed to stall, there were small moments of movement. An old lead re-examined with a new technique. A witness who suddenly remembered a detail in a conversation long past. Those moments never coalesced into closure, but they were the parts of the work that kept the case alive, like an ember keeps a hearth warm. To tell this story in a single sitting is to do damage to its subtlety. Missing person cases are collections of moments that refuse to congeal into a single answer. They are made of thousands of small human acts. The act of placing a call, the act of turning in a watch found by chance, the weary persistence of a detective who refuses to let a file cool. If there is a moral in Amy's disappearance, it is not a tidy one. It is a moral about how communities fracture and hold together, about how the wilderness is at once a place of freedom and a place that exposes us to the worst of chance, and about how an ordinary day can cleave into two separate lifetimes, the before and the after, along a strip of road where a car waits unlocked and a runner does not return. In the end, the most shocking thing about Amy's disappearance is not one single horror, but the accumulation of lacking. The vehicle that provided no clue, the watch that might have been hers, the journals that created suspicion without verdict, the person of interest who would not or could not clarify his whereabouts. All of these absences combine into a silence that is almost physical, a pressure that sits in the throat and does not leave. Families live with that silence every day. It is part of their landscape. Investigators live with it, too, and in some cases their careers are defined by it. The unsolved case that refuses to let them go. That silence is unbearable because it stubbornly resists the very human desire for order and explanation. If you ask someone who knew Amy to describe her, they will not hand you a theory. They will hand you smaller things, that she moved with a steady grace, that she loved to train with friends, that she had imagined an Olympic future. They will tell you how she laughed, how she set her jaw in training, how she could spend hours planning a local race, and then, improbably, forget to buy the race day ribbons until the last minute. Those anecdotes are the opposite of sensationalism. They are the human lodestones around which grief orbits. When all the forensic tests and interviews are done, the person who remains is not an object of speculation, but a human being whose face lingers in the corner of photographs and in the memory of people who once ran beside her. There are no neat endings here, no final press conference that ties up a narrative and allows the public to step back from the edge of the story. There is, instead, the slow pressure of time and the ongoing work of those who refuse to let the case be buried under its own silence. Amy was legally declared dead in 2004, an action that, however necessary, cannot stand in for the elemental knowledge of what happened on a single July afternoon more than 2 decades ago. The truth of that day, whatever it may be, sits somewhere between an abandoned car and a watch found by a stranger, between a husband's tortured privacy and a town's strained patience, between the possibilities of human violence and the indifferent threats of the wild. For now, those are coordinates rather than an answer. So we remember by the small things, the route she planned for a race that would never happen, the photos in which she is caught mid-stride, a dog named John's waiting in a house for the return of the person who always came back. The case remains unresolved, its perimeter constantly probed by careful hands and unsteady hearts. And the saddest, most human component of all is this simple arithmetic. A life cut off from the count of living, measured instead in anniversaries and fresh attempts to recall some forgotten step. People still retrace those steps. People still stand at Burnt Gulch on certain days and listen. In the wind that sweeps over the loop road, some say they can hear a cadence, faint like the echo of shoes. And for a moment the past presses against the present and insists, with a grief that will not be soothed, that a woman named Amy once ran there, and then did not run back. If this story leaves you unsettled, let that be part of its purpose. The unsolved disappearance of Amy Wroe Bechtel is not merely a puzzle to be solved. It is a wound in the map of a community that asks of us nothing less than attention. Attention to the lives behind headlines, to the small acts that make someone whole, to the profound loneliness of not knowing. The case remains active in the sense that problems without closure tend to be. They collect people around them, detectives, family members, amateur sleuths, who will not let silence claim a life without a fight. And for those who loved Amy, and for those who still hope to find an answer, the fight continues, patient as the wind, stubborn as a runner who refuses to stop until she is heard. Sources for key factual points above include case summaries and reporting compiled by Wikipedia and local Wyoming reporting, which provide the timeline of Amy Wroe Bechtel's disappearance, details about the discovery of her vehicle at Burnt Gulch, subsequent investigative developments, including journal entries and the later discovery of a watch, and named persons of interest. They kept returning to the places she had loved, not because those places held answers, but because they held the last coherent pictures anyone had of her. Burnt Gulch in the early morning is a place that will teach you how small a single life can look against the sweep of sky. The loop road bends like a question mark along the hills. The sagebrush catches the sun, and the river far below murmurs, as if it remembers everything. On anniversary mornings, friends and strangers would gather there with coffee and stale race ribbons, and they would stand in that thin air and say her name until the syllables felt like an offering that might bend the world back into shape. Steve would come sometimes. He learned over the years to sit inside grief rather than trying to fix it into a neat sentence. He had been young when Amy vanished, and the years had taught him things about patience he never wanted to have to learn. He spoke little at the gatherings. Where words failed him, he left small pragmatic marks: an extra bag of trash picked up from the trail, a single paper cup placed properly in a bin. He kept saying, in the private voice of someone who has been hollowed out and rebuilt, that remembering her meant keeping the map of ordinary things intact. The breeds of coffee she liked, the cadence she used to hum when she paced around planning a race, the way she would fold her socks before a long run. Those were the bones of daily life, and he feared that if they were smoothed away, the person they held would blur into myth. Her parents became the engines of memory. Grief in their hands was not a raw, spasming thing, but a long, cool labor, a project of maintenance. They would appear at community events, asking people to check old garages and barns, to look in the corners of storage lockers where items accumulate under the forgetfulness of years. They wrote letters to cold case units when forensic science took another step and could test yet smaller traces. They kept folders the size of bricks, each sheet a different lead, a different possibility. The folders aged with their hands. The paper yellowed, ink blurred at the corners. Still, they inventoried every phone call and every rumor as if, by doing so, they could construct a ladder back to a single rooftop where the answer might be nailed. Hope for them was not so much grand as ritual. Mailings, interviews, the stubborn placement of a single photograph in new frames. Detectives changed hands as careers cycled through the county. Some left for promotions, some retired, and new ones came who had never known the case as anything but a file thick with marginalia and faded news clippings. Aging detectives carried the memory of the case in a different way. It sat on their desks like a humming thing. They would occasionally stand at Burnt Gulch and look the light over the road and let the silence help them think. New tools, national DNA databases, improved satellite imagery, better preservation techniques, offered small, steady optimism. The file got scanned and rescanned. Software updated. Old photographs were enhanced pixel by pixel until faces and fence posts that had been blurred became clearer in grainy detail. Yet for every technological gain there remained the same blunt problem. Sometimes the essential evidence simply did not exist. A missing person leaves a hole, and some holes cannot be filled by machines. And yet, human work is stubborn in ways that technology is not. Volunteers still combed the land Sunday after Sunday, not because they expected to find the answer, but because the search itself was a form of solidarity. There are acts that do nothing to the mystery and everything to the living. Planting a tree near the trailhead, placing a weathered ribbon on a pine branch, leaving a note on a bulletin board signed, "Remembering Amy." Those acts were small monuments. They were the town's way of refusing to let a day be erased by the dullness of time. When new journalists or podcasters took up the case, they asked questions that had become rote in local conversation. Had anything been left unturned? Was there a lead that might have been missed because investigators had been too human, too distracted, or too tired? These outsiders brought a different energy to the files. Sometimes their questions led to new pressure on reluctant witnesses. Sometimes they stirred old tensions and resentments. The family's phone would ring with offers, interviews, documentaries, sympathetic essays, and they had to decide which invitations honored Amy and which traded on her absence. Grief does not come with a handbook, and the line between advocacy and exploitation is narrow and always shifting. There were nights when it seemed the town itself held its breath. A neighbor would call to say the dog had been howling. Someone else would report a truck they'd seen driving a certain way that no one had reported before. The flood of tips was a tide that pulled people into a shared hope and then left them on the shore with nothing to show. Each unproductive tip was a measure of a community that could not let go. The parents, the friends, the detectives, they all learned to convert agony into a different kind of labor. The slow, meticulous work of chasing echoes. Along the way, people made sense of it in different ways. Some found meaning in ritual, others in consequence. The disappearance changed how people moved through the wild. Running groups that had once scattered across the hills now adopted the habit of leaving trip plans with someone at home. Runners bought radios, carried whistles, trained in pairs. The change was prosaic and practical, one of those small cultural shifts that radiate quietly outward from a single event. It did not solve the mystery of the afternoon in July, but it altered behavior in a way that might save another life. In that sense, the tragedy bequeathed a kind of defensive intelligence to the town. For Amy's family, there came a moment years later, not a revelation, not a conquest to the unknown, but a reconciliation with living amid an ongoing absence. They began to conceive of their daughter's remembrance as something branching outward. Scholarship funds for young athletes, sponsored races in her name, community service projects inspired by her love of planning and organizing. That approach did something subtle but important. It allowed them to transform private sorrow into a shared project, a civic energy that both honored her memory and kept her name in circulation for those who might otherwise forget. Memory, they discovered, tends to survive when it is kept in use. Still, on nights when the house was quiet and the world outside was the same in different country, nights that demanded nothing and gave nothing in return, the family would sift through the old fibers of their lives, photographs, audio cassettes, letters. They would pull out the simplest things, a postcards with a hasty note about a training run, a coffee-stained race plan with scribbled splits. Those artifacts acted not as evidence, but as the last available companion to habit. They were the things you touch when you want to speak to someone, and there's no other way to reach them across absence. There is a particular cruelty to anniversaries. The day that should reconstitute memory into something neat instead becomes a drumbeat of missing. Yet communities know how to ritualize grief. They gather in the cold and say names aloud. On one such morning, the sun arrived early and the sky was clean, the kind of blue that makes every object look like a truth. A line of runners, some wearing old race shirts with her name faded across the front, took off along the loop road. For a stretch, they ran in silence. No one tried to speak the thing the landscape seemed not to want to give up. Step by step, breath by breath, they filled the space with a physical presence. In that small procession, there was an argument being made. She had been here, she had lived, and the town would carry her memory with the steady stubbornness of footfalls. In the end, The case remained what it had been for years, open and unresolved. But unresolved cases do not mean the absence of consequence. They rearrange lives around a void. They influence behavior, law enforcement approaches, and even public memory. People who had never met Amy would tell the story to their children as a caution and a remembrance. In kitchens and on treadmills, her name kept returning like a refrain. The last scene of this story is not a discovery or an explanation. Those are the kinds of endings that satisfy a certain appetite for closure. They wrap a hard line through narrative and let the audience exhale. This ending is quieter, less certain, and perhaps truer to the way lives actually persist after an absence. On a late summer evening, years after the day she vanished, a small group of people gathered at the trailhead. The air smelled of dry sage and river mud. Lanterns swung gently. Someone strummed a guitar that had been tuned badly by grief and use. Stories were told, not theories, but small anecdotes. The way she laced her shoes, the ridiculousness of a training playlist, the way she would always forget the race ribbons until the last minute. Laughter came, not loud but real, threaded with something like relief. Someone, an elderly man who had once been among her training partners, stood up and said, simply, "We keep running." It was a line that could have been about habit or defiance or memory. People nodded. The word felt right in that setting. They had run the same roads because running was what she had done, and running was how they chose to carry her forward. It was not a solution to a puzzle. It was a way to place the weight of an absence into motion. They lit a single candle and set it near a cairn of small stones at the path's edge. The candle guttered in the wind and kept burning. The light was no revelation, it was a signal. Some signals demand immediate rescue. Others are a quiet insistence that the world remember, for as long as anyone is willing to hold a match to a wick. They walked along the road in pairs, voices low, shoes leaving fresh impressions in dust that, for a while, looked like a plain record of a life continuing. That night, when the last of the visitors drove away and the town returned to its ordinary hum, the wind came and argued with the trees. It moved over the loop road in a way that, for a moment, sounded to those who listened like another runner's cadence. Perhaps it was only the wind. Perhaps it was the way memory mimics what it misses. The sound hung in the long air, neither proof nor promise, simply a reminder that some absences are permanent and that the actions of the living are the only remedies we have. The story of Amy Wroe Bechtel does not end with the neat finality of a case closed. It ends instead with an open line of people who hold a light against a wide country and carry memory forward by small human acts, running, telling stories, defending against forgetfulness. That is not the same as resolution, but it is its own kind of truth. Life, in the aftermath of mystery, must continue somehow, knotting itself to ritual and community and the stubbornness of the human heart. So it remains an unsolved disappearance, like a notch in the map that refuses to be smoothed over. The search had shifted shape over the years, from frantic to methodical, from public spectacle to quiet, patient work. People kept watching the road, listening for footsteps, and comparing them to the cadence they remembered. And in the hush of the high country, under a sky wider than most imaginations, the echo of those footsteps still drew people back, not because they wanted the story to be dramatic, but because they wanted it to be true. They wanted the person under the name to be held, in whatever small ways living memory could manage, against the sweep of time. To date, Wyoming still mourns for Amy's sad, mysterious disappearance. Please don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and turn on the notification bell, so you stay updated with mystery stories that strike. Thanks for watching.